The following video has spoilers for the Simpsons game and the Simpsons Hit and Run. For the sake of clarity, this video is more focused on aspects of the latter than the former, so if you'd like a more comprehensive idea of my thoughts on the Simpsons game, I made a standalone video for that game that you can watch. This video should be seen as a sort of companion piece to that video, so if you haven't seen it yet, I recommend you do so. It will be linked in the description. In that video, I name-dropped another licensed game based on The Simpsons. After the onset of 3D, they evolved into genre copycats, such as Simpsons Wrestling and Simpsons
Hit and Run.
At that point, I hadn't really given Hit and Run the time of day because I wanted to focus more on the Simpsons game itself. I didn't want to clutter the video with too many comparisons to previous entries. I figured it would be more valuable to examine another entry on its own instead. The two games were released only 4 years apart, so for the fans who were able to experience the launch windows of both games, it's very hard to separate them. Comparisons between them were inevitable, so for this video, I'd like to put myself in those shoes. Having now played Hit and Run, I'm revisiting the Simpsons game with a new context. By the end, I hope to see what the Simpsons game might have taken from Hit and Run to improve its gameplay. Or not. Let's set the 2007 game aside for a moment, and focus on Hit and Run's own strengths and weaknesses. It was probably reasonable to assume that most people looking to play Hit and Run in 2003 had probably played Road Rage or some variation of Grand Theft Auto prior to it, so the learning curve is kept pretty comfortable. The controls for Hit and Run's driving mechanics include dedicated buttons for acceleration, braking, reverse, and even for the horn. Your first time playing, there's almost no way to avoid hitting something. But why would you? The level of destruction you can muster is part of the appeal. The platforming is about as simple as it gets as well. One button to jump, one to attack, one for interaction. You get the idea, and this is consistent for all playable characters. This lack of complexity is a blessing because there are numerous vehicles to unlock that have their own unique attributes. In casual conversations, I would barely be able to count on one hand how many distinct cars that feature prominently in the first dozen seasons of the show. Vehicles are ancillary to the story in any given episode, and with rare exception, even given much attention at all. Cars simply aren't something that The Simpsons is especially known for, and it's interesting to see how the developers were able to stretch the driving concept out for the game. Each car's visual design in Hit and Run gives a pretty good indication of how fast it will go, how well it will turn, and so forth. As the game progresses, the player can get a feel for which vehicles work the best for given missions, find their favorites, and develop their own playstyle along the way. The clear distinguishing features of each car is what sets Hit and Run apart from other GTA-style games. But Hit and Run's gameplay is less about the driving, and more about navigating the environment. That sounds like a pretty pedantic thing to say about a GTA clone, but there is a difference. Typically, at the beginning of missions, you find yourself in some very obvious locations, but by the end, you've somehow made your way through the power plant or the stonecutter shortcut. It is a bit odd to see the traffic-friendly version of the power plant, but this specific setting illustrates the point that the environments in Hit and Run serve the gameplay first. You always get a taste of some portions of the wider Springfield as you're focused on your current objectives, beckoning you to explore them once you're done. The completion of a chapter further teases you with a list of items and secrets you missed as well. This kind of engagement is the ideal outcome for almost any open world game you can think of. There isn't necessarily anything that interesting to find all the time, but sometimes there is. Obviously, the driving is not meant to be realistic, but there are times when striking a vehicle at an angle would grind you to a halt instead of slowing you down, as if you hit a bag of sand instead of sliding off the steel and aluminum body of a vehicle. This is a mostly fine way to play the game until you encounter missions with razor-thin margins of error. Timers are employed in many missions, and sometimes require multiple objectives to be completed in that time. Targets you have to follow too often escape your pursuit even after seemingly minor mistakes. That's where the disconnect in gameplay occurs the most. One moment it's about wanton destruction, the next it's about precise turns and timing.
What in the hell were you thinking, sir?
These aren't necessarily clashing gameplay priorities, and it can be somewhat thrilling to make it to your objective at the last second. But in practice, they are incredibly unbalanced. Some missions have you follow targets that are too slow, forcing you to fail a mission that requires driving and platforming, which is already about as slow and imprecise as it can be. A little more time spent on playtesting those missions might have ironed out these issues. But as it is, it's way too difficult. Despite the aforementioned issues, the platforming and collecting is more of an extra feature to the game and doesn't make or break the overall experience. The camera system makes the platforming more difficult than it should be, but it's still nice to not be constrained to a vehicle all the time. Hitting and running is what you come to this game for, after all. You can get away with doing the bare minimum in this regard, and you aren't punished for not exploring. The story is adequately silly. Kang and Kodos are up to their old tricks, but the story is framed as a mystery, which helps to inform the missions and guide exploration. Aliens secretly recording a reality show is kind of a product of its time, but it works. My only problem really is with the execution. The B-shaped drones used in this plot look like they're assets mistakenly lifted from another video game. I understand that they needed to stand out among other collectibles, and seem threatening to a degree to want to attack them. But their realistic and unappealing designs make them stick out a little too much to feel like they're part of the game. Perhaps this was meant to serve as a kind of misdirection. If they were flying saucers with cameras equipped to them instead, then conclusions would have been drawn instantly. But the opening movie and Bart's abduction about halfway through the story clearly give the villains away anyway. Since I'm on the topic of art direction, just from first impressions, it's really hard to look at Hit and Run and take it very seriously. It's based on The Simpsons, of course, and that comes with its own quirks, but realistically shaded 3D models have historically not done the license justice. So if I'm going to go for complete honesty, the game is pretty ugly. It looks less like I'm playing as The Simpsons than I am playing as theme park versions of The Simpsons. The Simpsons game at least had the good sense to employ cell shading. It also loses points for originality. If I were buying this game in 2003, I might scoff at the idea of Hit and Run as a concept. It's blatantly obvious where Hit and Run takes its inspirations from. Radical Entertainment reused assets developed for Road Rage. An understandable concession to make when deadlines are tight, but just because you can make a GTA clone doesn't mean it's a good idea. It's just too unpolished, and it doesn't expand on the premise enough to really give it an edge. So as far as initial complaints go, the Simpsons game wins over Hit and Run. But first impressions are just that. First. After spending time with Hit and Run, I can recall far more easily the times I was impressed with that game, more than its successor. Whenever I played a new mission, I could count on it providing a new mood or atmosphere after a big story beat. For example, playing as Lisa for the first time comes at the heels of Bart getting abducted by Kang and Kodos. It takes place at sunset, which changes the entire color scheme for Springfield, offering a completely different vibe during the desperate search for Bart. Some of the better directed episodes of the show have similar stylish flourishes in the lighting. It's not always consistent in the game, but I believe I prefer a more atmospheric game over a more color-accurate game any day. I would be remiss as a critic if I didn't acknowledge that it's kind of unfair to go too far in comparing the two games, since they are a bit removed from each other in what they ask players to do. The only thing they really have in common are the cast and the writing staff. In the Simpsons game, players advance the story through action platforming, while in Hit and Run, players advance its story by completing missions that revolve around its driving mechanics. The larger open Springfield in the latter needed to be large enough for driving and make sense geographically. Players can drive anywhere in the game and find something to occupy their time. Nothing about the map feels superfluous at all. Even the simplistic platforming is meant to direct the characters around the setting in a somewhat meaningful way. Despite being a larger version of Springfield, the world of Hit and Run feels much more alive. It helps that Radical wasn't limited by only including known characters to populate the city. Nameless NPC pedestrians pepper the streets, and non-distinct cars provide realistic traffic patterns generated at random. They work as road hazards during gameplay, but they also achieve a feeling that there's more going on in the setting than the scope of the game itself. You really can't say the same for the Simpsons game. Instead of trying to build a world around its gameplay, it featured a more true-to-spec recreation of Springfield, whose utility was primarily a hub between missions. I stand by my opinion that the Simpsons game would have done better to omit the open Springfield in favor of chapter selection or a Mario-style overworld method of progression between stages. By contrast, Hit and Run can at least offer something in the way of shortcuts if you explore. Watch my retrospective for my full assessment, but in short, the Simpsons game is a wasted effort of mixed priorities. It doesn't afford many reasons to interact with the environment outside of completing the main objectives, and when it does, it makes you wonder why you even bother. It's one of the most inconsistent high-budget action platformers I've ever played. I hate to say it, but The Simpsons Hit and Run is not a great game. I wouldn't even say it's a game I recommend. The physics and driving mechanics need a lot of refining, the visuals are a bit disjointed and dated, and the IP can only go so far with this specific gameplay premise. The most egregious thing about the game is that the mission constraints are uneven to the point of feeling cheap. But I would prefer to play Hit and Run over the 2007 game any day of the week. Many licensed games suffer from a lack of time or budget, and even lack of focus. Sometimes all three. Hit and Run is outclassed by many games of its time and genre, but the level of focus afforded to the game despite those limitations makes it a beacon of light among the sea of shovelware and rushed movie tie-ins. The PC version is able to take advantage of modern features and mod support. This version could more or less nullify any issues I have, and it's a good option for anyone who still wants to play it. It's a shame that the more popular console versions can't enjoy the same luxury. Putting my brain into 2003 terms, the reason why you might want to play Hit and Run over other games is likely the brand recognition. You're at least guaranteed a few laughs along the way, even if you're not familiar with the games it's trying to copy. It makes sense that those that are younger might find the concept appealing, if only because they might have seen their parents or older siblings play GTA, only to be denied it for being too young. Hit and Run occupies a nice middle ground between maturity and immaturity. The series' colorful veneer was always good at obscuring the darkly irreverent humor that it's famous for. That leads me to the most prestigious acknowledgement that I can give The Simpsons Hit and Run. It reminds me of why I even like The Simpsons in the first place. Even though it replicates a lot of dated gameplay trends of its time, it executes them well enough and never takes itself seriously. To reiterate a point in my Simpsons Game video, the biggest reason why it fails is that it was constructed as an effort to impress. The Simpsons Game desperately tries to pull too much from its legacy as it can, in bad faith. The Simpsons Hit and Run knows what it is. It doesn't just succeed by keeping your expectations low and exceeding them. However, you can't escape the reputation that licensed games have. It's one product among many other merchandising efforts. It was not designed to represent The Simpsons as a whole. Taking that into account, all this is to really say is that The Simpsons Hit and Run takes what it has and it runs with it.
Chest pain! Having chest pain!
Please consider supporting my videos by subscribing and checking out my Patreon page. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.